So, happy Sabbath to you all, and welcome back into our look into the life of Joseph. Now, in part 1, we looked at the life of Joseph and explored his birth, the death of his mother when he was a teenager. We saw how the favouritism of his father Jacob led to his brothers hating him so much, they ended up selling him into slavery, where he ended up in Egypt at age 17. Now, he worked well and became Potiphar's chief steward. And then, after resisting the sexual advances of Potiphar's wife, she falsely accused him of rape, where he was then thrown into prison. Now, Joseph then interpreted the dreams of 2 of Pharaoh's servants who were also cast into prison. We saw that one was restored to his old position, and the other loses his life, as predicted by Joseph. Now, after that, Joseph continues to languish in prison, which is where we left the story of Joseph at the end of part 1. Now, we pick up the story of Joseph now in chapter 41 of the book of Genesis, where we read, "Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream." Now, just when Joseph thought he might get a chance to get out of prison with the help of the butler who was restored to his position, as predicted by Joseph, he was forgotten by the butler, and there he sat in prison for another 2 full years before God chose to intervene. Now, later in the same chapter, it states that Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. Now, the age of 30 years is a significant age, marking a certain level of maturity, and it was the minimum age for Levites to begin their service in the tabernacle, not to mention the age of Jesus Christ when he began his ministry. Now, as I noted when I covered lessons from Jacob, Joseph's grandfather Isaac died a year earlier when Joseph was 29 years old. Now, God begins to intervene by giving the Pharaoh 2 very powerful and vivid dreams. Now, in his first dream, there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine-looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. Now, in Pharaoh's second dream, 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. Now, it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Now, dreams were very important in the ancient world, as seen in this papyrus here called the Book of Dreams that dates to the Middle Kingdom period in Egypt. Now, pharaohs had magicians on hand to interpret these dreams. Now, Pharaoh told his magicians the dreams, but none of them could give him a satisfactory interpretation of those dreams. Now, at least the magicians were told what the dreams were like, unlike those in Nebuchadnezzar's court when he dreamt of a great image representing the 4 Gentile kingdoms from Babylon to Rome. Now, Pharaoh is troubled by these dreams and he can't get a satisfactory explanation. And finally, the butler pipes up and remembers Joseph. He speaks up and says to Pharaoh, "There was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him and he interpreted our dreams. And it came to pass just as he interpreted for us, so it happened." And then Sarah sends and calls for Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved and changed his clothing and came to Pharaoh. Now, one interesting detail in this verse is the bit about Joseph being shaved. And we've got examples of ancient shavers found in Egypt. Now, Egyptian pharaohs were all clean-shaven without facial hair, unlike the emperors of Assyria and Babylon, who were always depicted with long beards. Now, the only beard that Pharaohs wore was an actual clip-on, thin metal beard called a postiche, which they would usually wear with this striped headcloth that was called a nemes. Now, in addition to the pharaohs, the Egyptian priests were not only clean-shaven, but shaved their entire bodies. And then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years of famine. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt, to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine." So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. So we see here that Joseph tells the Pharaoh that the 2 different dreams that God gave him have the same interpretation. There will be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Now, not only does Joseph give him the correct interpretation from God, he also gives him a solid plan how to help the nation of Egypt to get through the 7 years of famine by saving 1/5 of the produce during the 7 years of plenty. Now, Pharaoh is greatly impressed by the wise advice that Joseph gives him along with the rest of Pharaoh's court. Now this brings us to the 5th lesson that we can learn from Joseph's life, and that is to have a contingency plan to help you deal with future problems and emergencies. Now this is essentially the message of a proverb that's repeated twice in the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs 22:3 and 27:12, which says, "A prudent man foresees evil and hides himself, but the simple pass on and are punished." Quote. Now we need to look ahead to see the potential problems in the future and do what we can to avoid or minimise their impact on our lives. Now this can take many forms, like having enough savings to cover unexpected bills, taking out insurance where appropriate and needed, having enough superannuation or savings for retirement, preparing for bad weather if we're in a vulnerable area, or having supplies of items to cover ourselves in case of shortages, for example, toilet paper. Like the Scouts motto, always be prepared. Now, after Joseph gave Pharaoh the interpretation and a great plan to help save the country through the famine that would follow the years of plenty we read, Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it onto Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Now, Egyptian records show that when viziers were invested with power, they were given a signet ring, fine linen, and a gold chain. So we see here from being a slave in prison, Joseph, in an absolutely stunning turnaround, is given the position of second in power in Egypt, a position that was referred to in Egypt as being a vizier. Now, the last mention of Potiphar that we see in the book of Genesis is when Potiphar sends Joseph into prison. We hear nothing about him after this. We don't know how he may have felt and reacted to this sudden change of fortune in Joseph, who has now been elevated above him. Now, if Potiphar did suspect his wife was lying to him about the rape charge, I suspect he would have been delighted to see Joseph both a free man and in a great position to serve the Egyptian people. And God has granted incredible favour to Joseph and his Pharaoh, who is now elevated to him to second in power over the Egyptian people. Now this brings us to the 6th lesson that we can learn from Joseph's life. Maintain your trust in God through the dark times, and He will be faithful and exalt you in the long run. Now, I remember a few years back when I went through a very long period of unemployment, how things got tough for me personally. I eventually changed career and became a courier. Now, to begin with, the pay was quite poor, and so the struggle continued for another couple of years, along with issues that I had with my van that was very costly. It was very frustrating trying to get ahead financially. Now, in the last few years, my situation has totally turned around from that quite dramatically. Now, I had at least 3 major unasked for offers of financial assistance from close friends that blew me away and really made a difference. And then in the last 12 months, with trying to get extra pay, it's gone from struggling to try and get blood out of the stone to just the windows of heaven opening up from the heavens. Now, God is good and He does care for us deeply, and when the time is right, He will exalt us if we stay faithful to Him. Now, do we have any historical or archaeological evidence for Joseph and which Egyptian pharaoh it was who was given dreams from God and who promoted Joseph to second in charge over Egypt? Now, to find the evidence for Joseph, we need to confirm in time where in Egyptian history we need to look for such evidence. I'm only going to briefly touch on the dating issues, which I covered much more detail in part 1 of Lessons from Moses. I'll just touch on a few of the highlights here. Now, the true biblical date for the Exodus is around 1450 BC, some 480 years before Solomon's work on the temple. However, some liberal Christian scholars argue that it occurred 200 years later, around 1250 BC, when Ramses the Great ruled. However, that would give far too short a period for the time of the judges. Now, on the standard timeline of Egypt, 1450 BC falls during the time of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. Now, the time in the ancient world when dynasties 18 and 19, when Ramses the Great ruled, is referred to by archaeologists as the late Bronze Age. Now, the main reason for why there is so much scepticism in the academic world about the Exodus and the conquest of Palestine by the Israelites is that there is a complete lack of evidence for these events during the late Bronze Age. Now, prior to the late Bronze Age came the period known as the Middle Bronze Age, and there have been calls in recent decades for Egypt's timeline to be moved forward, from some scholars advocating that the Exodus date of around 1450 BC was at the end of Egypt's Middle Kingdom during the Middle Bronze Age. Now, in a nutshell, the 2 big problems that archaeologists have with believing the Bible's account of the Exodus using either of those 2 dates put forward in the 18th or 19th dynasties are: 1, both of the 18th and 19th dynasties are very well documented, and there is not a single hint of a great catastrophe impacting Egypt at either time. And 2, most of the cities the Bible tells us were conquered by the Israelites were not occupied during the late Bronze Age, such as Jericho. Now, one major piece of evidence putting the Exodus earlier in Egypt's timeline during the Middle Bronze Age is that we have a record from the end of the Middle Kingdom during Egypt's 13th dynasty that is eerily similar to the plagues of Egypt recorded in the book of Exodus. Now, Egypt's 18th and 19th dynasties were periods of great expansion and incredible prosperity for Egypt, the complete opposite of the state of Egypt after the plagues that God struck Egypt with. However, we know that there was a collapse of civilization in Egypt during the 13th dynasty when Egypt was and it was later invaded by foreigners called the Hyksos, who took advantage of their weakened state. Now, this earlier time is a far better fit in Egypt for the Exodus than the late Bronze Age. Now, the situation is much the same in Palestine when we compare the archaeology of the Middle Bronze Age against that of the late Bronze Age. Now, in this chart here, that created by John Gibson, an article he put into the SIS review. He created this chart to compare the finds for both the Middle and Bronze Age that we find in the cities that Joshua conquered in Palestine. Now, for the Middle Bronze Age, there is excellent agreement for all the sites noted as being conquered by Joshua, with most having high walls and being conquered during the Middle Bronze Age. Now, for the corresponding time of the Late Bronze Age, Jericho has got no Late Bronze Age cities, and most of the cities noted as being conquered by Joshua have little or no remains in the Late Bronze Age. Now, the standard chronology of Egypt puts the Exodus in the Late Bronze Age, and this would mean that the time of Joseph, therefore, would be at the time of the Hyksos, foreign rule over Egypt, if the standard chronology was correct. However, if the Exodus did indeed take place at the end of the Middle Kingdom, then the correct place on Egypt's timeline to find Joseph, as well as his pharaoh, is in the early to middle part of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Now, this time in Egypt is when the 12th dynasty ruled over Egypt. Now, David Roll and Donovan Corville are two scholars who support a Middle Bronze Age Exodus. Now, they advocate two different 12th dynasty pharaohs for the pharaoh that elevated Joseph to power. Now, David Roll chooses Amenemhat III, the sixth pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, as Joseph's pharaoh. Now, he's the rather miserable looking guy on the right hand side here. Now, Donovan Corville chooses the much happier looking chap on the left, Sesostris I, as Joseph's pharaoh. Now, Sesostris I was an earlier pharaoh. He was the second pharaoh in that dynasty. Now, Corville sees a number of lines of evidence supporting a significant overlap between dynasties 12 and 13, hence why he chooses a much earlier pharaoh for Joseph's pharaoh. Now, David Roll notes in the Pharaoh's Dream that the fat cows and the skinny cows both came out of the Nile, indicating that the Nile was the source of both the plenty and the famine. Now, this is a good point of logic. Now, David Roll provides evidence of the high Nile floods in Amenemhat III's reign and points to this as being from the time of Joseph. He says that the excessive rainfall upstream caused excessive flooding and was the source of the famine. Now, personally, I don't find that compelling evidence, as one would naturally think that too little rain, not too much rain, would be the cause of the famine. Now, this seems to be supported in the biblical account, since the famine was felt hard in neighbouring Israel, where flooding would definitely not have caused the famine. Now, David Roll's best evidence comes from the centralisation of power that occurred in the reign of Sesostris III, the fifth pharaoh. Now, Sesostris III was the pharaoh just before David Roll's candidate, Amenemhat III. Now, if his candidate was Joseph's pharaoh, and if this centralisation occurred during Sesostris III's reign, then the main transfer of land from the regional nomarchs occurred under the previous pharaoh, and was not due to the policy of sending the land for food during the time of Joseph's famine. Now, the other possibilities are that Sesostris III was Joseph's pharaoh, or some centralisation may have begun with Joseph's pharaoh and later been further tightened with by other pharaohs such as Sesostris III. Now, this one here, Sesostris III, had a reputation as a cruel tyrant. Now, this reputation makes him a better candidate for being a pharaoh of Israel's later oppression, rather than a pharaoh who was so complimentary and generous toward a Hebrew slave like Joseph. Now, as you can see from this statue of Amenemhat III, he's a rather miserable looking pharaoh. Now, David Roll believes that the downturned face of Amenemhat III, as well as Sesostris III, is the result of a sad anxiety from the stress of the times brought on by famine. Now, regardless of whether that's true or not, I think I'll just start calling it Pharaoh Grumpy Cat. Now, Donovan Corville believes that the second pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Sesostris I, was Joseph's pharaoh, and that the 12th and 13th dynasties were mostly parallel, except for at the end of the 12th dynasty when two dynasty 13 rulers ruled over Egypt after the end of the 12th dynasty. Now, Cornwall in his book, The Exodus Problem and Its Ramifications, writes that in the royal tomb of Ra-Ab, who was the 13th king, near the middle of the 13th dynasty, were found canopic jars sealed with the impression reading Ra in mud, which is a name that's recognised as an alternate for Amenemhat III, who ruled during the 12th dynasty. So this is good evidence that the two dynasties overlap for a considerable period of time. Now, Josephus also wrote that the Israelites were involved in building the pyramids when they were in Egypt. Now, the lesser pyramids of the Middle Kingdom were the only pyramids built with mud brick and straw, the same materials noted in the Bible that were being used by the Israelites for building during their slavery. Now, one of these mud brick pyramids is right next to a town called Kahun. Now, Kahun is several miles away from the mud brick pyramid of Amenemhat III, who was David Roll's candidate for Joseph. But also, Kahun happens to be right next door to the pyramid of Sesostris II, who reigned 2 pharaohs before David Roll's choice. Now, the Semitic dwellers of Kahun were quite likely to have been Israelites, who were probably likely to have been the workforce for the pyramid of Sesostris II. Now, Sesostris I, just going on his appearance, looks like a much happier chap. The sort of nice guy who looks more likely to have shown favour and appreciation to Joseph. Now, based on the various evidence that David Cornwall has presented, I believe that he is the most likely pharaoh to have been Joseph's pharaoh. Now, in Genesis 41:50, we read that Joseph married Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, who was the priest of On. Now, at On, today there is an obelisk known as the Pillar of On, which was built by Sesostris I. Now, On means the city of the sun, which is why the Greeks later called it Heliopolis, and Jeremiah 43:13 referred to it as Beth Shemesh, the same name as the city in Israel where the ark eventually was brought back after the Philistines took it. Now, On is very close to Egypt's capital, Cairo, and it was the capital during the Middle Kingdom, so this is another piece of good evidence supporting the Middle Kingdom as the time of Joseph, rather than the Hyksos period where the standard chronology puts it. Now, Joseph was given a new name by the Pharaoh, Zaphnath-Paneah. Now, this title means the salvation or abundance of the life or living. Now, the Pharaoh is deeply grateful for his role as a saviour of the people, even at the start of the 14 years of plenty followed by famine. Now, this high title, meaning salvation or saviour of the living, is actually one of the many amazing titles of the vizier of Sesostris I, that we've seen good evidence for was Joseph's pharaoh. Now, Sesostris I had a powerful vizier by the name of Mentuhotep. Now, he held titles that, according to Breasted, read like the declaration of the king's powers, which is similar to the extraordinary titles that Joseph's pharaoh bestowed upon him. Now, there are 2 particular titles shown here that are especially interesting. One is overseer of the double granary, and the giver of goods, sustaining alive the people. Now, that sustaining alive the people sounds very much like the meaning of Zaphnath-Paneah that we just looked at. Now, on the right-hand side there, you can see a statue that's in the Louvre in Paris today of Mentuhotep that's been decapitated. Now, this destruction is quite easily understandable in the light of the hatred of the Israelites that was fostered by the pharaohs that ruled after Joseph. Now, during the 7 years of plenty, Joseph's wife Asenath bears Joseph 2 sons. Now, the firstborn son he calls Manasseh, which means forget, because God has helped him to forget all the bad times he's experienced in Egypt, and also how his brothers treated him. Now, the second son he calls Ephraim, which means doubly fruitful, because God has extra blessed him in Egypt, where he originally came as a slave. Now, when I spoke about lessons from Jacob, we looked at some of the evidence that points to the descendants of Joseph becoming the British and American peoples. Now, up until recently, these peoples were overwhelmingly Caucasian in appearance. Now, Joseph has married an Egyptian woman by nationality, but what was her ethnicity or racial appearance? Now, today, most Egyptians have reddish-brown skin, being mostly Arabs. Now, ancient Egyptian artists portray the skin of Egyptian males by painting them red. Now, Egyptian women of high rank, by contrast, were not ridden by long exposure to the sun, spending most of their time indoors. Now, upper-class women were usually represented by their artists with pale or light yellow skin. Now, the statue of pharaohs over the many dynasties do actually show variances in racial type. Now, while it's hard to be definitive with statues that are only one major colour in appearance, the statue of Joseph's pharaoh Sesostris I does look more Caucasian than Arab in appearance, so the nobility at this time may have reflected that racial appearance. Now, Corval has additional evidence supporting his view that the second pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Sesostris I, was Joseph's pharaoh. Now, he notes two famine inscriptions which are dated to the reign of Sesostris I. Now, the famine inscriptions of Ameni and Biba both meet the criteria for the famine of Joseph's time in three major respects. The famine lasted a plurality of years. Preparation was made in advance to meet the famine by gathering in the food. And thirdly, this food was distributed during the years of famine. Now, Grant Jeffrey, in his book The Signature of God, gives the remarkable translation of two ancient inscriptions that were found in Yemen at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, the first inscription reads, "We dwelt in this castle 7 years of good life. How difficult for memory its description. Then came years barren and burnt up. When one evil year had passed, then another came to succeed it." Now, in the second inscription it reads, "In thy name, O God, the God of Hanyar, I, Tajar, the daughter of Zeus Safar, sent my steward to Joseph," before she talks about the difficulty she had in trying to obtain grain. Now, Joseph had to be careful of selling the grain reserves of Egypt for gold and silver to everyone because of the danger that the grain would run out. Now, when the famine was at its peak, grain was much more valuable than gold or money. Now, this brings us back to the story of Joseph and his family, who now have to find a way to get through the 7 years of famine. Now, we pick up the story again in Genesis 42, which I'm going to paraphrase here. Now, first of all, Jacob sends all of his sons, except for Benjamin, down to Egypt to buy grain. Now, Joseph saw his brothers and recognised them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them, accusing them of being spies. Now, to prove that they're not spies, Joseph demands they bring Benjamin to Egypt while he holds on to Simeon. Now, the brothers are laden with guilt, believing that this horrible situation has come on them because of what they did to Joseph. Now, Joseph pretends not to know the language of Canaan by speaking through an interpreter, but turns away and weeps when he hears how guilty they feel about selling him as a slave. Now, he gives them grain, but arranges to put their grain money in their sacks without them realising it. And when they return to Canaan, they are horrified to find that their money is in their sacks, worrying that they might be accused of being thieves. Now, moving on to the next chapter, chapter 33, we read how they used up all their grain and then still need more. Now, Jacob then relents on allowing them to take Benjamin to Egypt. Now, Jacob tells them to take the original money they found in the sacks back to Joseph, plus more to buy grain, plus an additional gift in case there's any trouble over the potential thievery. And when they get down to Egypt, Joseph has them dine with them at lunchtime. Now, after Joseph inquires about their father and is introduced to Benjamin, he is overwhelmed with emotion As seeing Benjamin, he ducks out again to weep privately. Now, while they're having lunch, Joseph arranges to have them all sit in order of their age, astonishing the brothers, and he then gives 5 times as much food to young Benjamin. Now, in the next chapter, chapter 44, we read that Joseph sells them all grain, and then he tests the brothers one more time by arranging to have a cup placed in Benjamin's sack. Now, Joseph's steward accuses them of stealing the cup, and then discovers the cup in Benjamin's sack. And when they're brought back to Joseph, Joseph accuses them of stealing and pretends that he can practice divination from such a cup. He decrees that Benjamin shall become his slave. And then we find Judah, who then pleads to take his place as his slave, which is a remarkable turnaround from Judah, who was the one to suggest that they sell Joseph to the passing traders in the first place. Now, in chapter 45, we read that eventually Joseph can't hold it back any longer. He's weeping uncontrollably, so he sends out his servants and tells the brothers that he is Joseph. Now, this would have been an incredibly emotional scene that is well portrayed in the Time Life Bible movie about Joseph, starring Aussie actor Paul Mercurio, better known from the movie Strictly Ballroom. Now, Joseph shows mercy and forgiveness to his brothers, telling him that it was God's will that he would go to Egypt and be put into a position to preserve life. Now, this brings us to our 7th lesson that we can learn from Joseph's life. Have a forgiving attitude like Joseph had with his brothers who sold him into slavery. Now, Joseph saw God's hand in everything that had happened, from his first dreams to his enslavement, imprisonment, exaltation, and at last reconciliation with his family. Now, later in chapter 50, he tells his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." Now, permeating Joseph's announcement of God's guidance of events is the expression of forgiveness for all that they had done to him. Now, forgiveness requires a willingness to trust God that he will work things out for us and eventually bring about justice. We should see everyone as a potential son or daughter of God. Now, everyone eventually will repent of their sins, or God will cast them into the lake of fire. So justice will eventually be done in the end. We should trust that God will restore what another may have taken from us, and that he will provide for us. We don't need, and we shouldn't harbour a grudge or hold on to anger against others, knowing that God will always provide for us. He has forgiven each of us so much. Now, if we sense that we are holding on to a grudge, we should remember Jesus' stern words to us that God will not forgive us if we do not forgive others. Now, there are still 5 years of famine to go, and Joseph tells his brothers to let Jacob know that he's still alive and he's been made vizier over Egypt, and to bring him and his family down to Egypt. Joseph now sends a message by his brothers to his father to tell him that he's alive and well. Now, we're into the 2nd year of the famine, and this is now 9 years since he was elevated by the Pharaoh to second charge over Egypt. Now, while he was a slave, he wouldn't have been able to get a message to his father. Yet when he is free during the 7 years of plenty and has the means to get a message to his father, so why didn't he ever get a message to his father? Now, in a 1993 Bible Review article called "Why Joseph Didn't Call Home," Arnold Aegis gives what I believe is the most logical answer for why he didn't send a message earlier. He writes, "Perhaps Joseph's silence over the years can be explained on the basis of political expediency, as suggested by the medieval exegete Avenel. As Pharaoh's second in command, Joseph had to be extremely circumspect in terms of his attachments and relationships. He was, after all, a foreigner, a non-Egyptian, There could be no suspicion regarding his absolute loyalty to the Egyptian crown. End of quote. Now, we don't know for sure where Jacob is when he gets the news about Joseph, though it's more likely that he's in Hebron rather than Shechem. Now, it says his heart stood still because he did not believe them when he was given the unbelievable news that Joseph is both alive and vizier over Egypt. He then sees the many casks of goods sent up with the brothers, which convinces him that the news is actually true. Now, when he gets to Beersheba, he makes a sacrifice. And there, God encourages him in a dream to continue on and go down to Egypt. Now, in Genesis 46:26, we are told that the 11 sons of Jacob and their children numbered 66. Now, in the next verse, we're told that all the persons of the house of Jacob who went to Egypt were 70. Now, the additional 4 people, apart from the 66 just mentioned, were Jacob, Joseph, and his 2 sons. Now, in the Greek version of the scriptures, the Septuagint, 75 is the number mentioned in verse 27, not 75. And this number of 75 is also quoted by Stephen in his famous sermon in Acts 7. Now, some commentators believe this number of 75 is the 66 mentioned previously, plus 9 living wives of the sons of Jacob. Now, remember in the story of Abraham where he said that there were over 300 men born in his household when he decided to go and rescue Lot. Now, there was a large entourage of servants, perhaps even more than 1,000. Now, we get the impression that the women, who were mostly of the same race as Jacob's sons, were off limits, at least for Isaac and Jacob, as their fathers saw wives for them back in Haran. So, where and how did Joseph's brothers get their wives? Now, they're just about all married by the time they all go down to Egypt. And it's likely that Jacob relaxed any restrictions that may have been in place previously to marry amongst the servants of the household. Now, the last time that we read about Jacob's own daughter Dinah is the debacle that occurred at Shechem after Simeon and Levi killed her husband. Now, we don't know if she ever remarried. Now, if she did marry and had children, is there perhaps some sort of lost 13th tribe of Dinah out there somewhere? However, what we have to remember is that any children that she may have had would have been counted as members of the tribe of their father rather than their mother. Now, she may have married one of the brothers, as Jewish legend suggests that she may have married one of the brothers of Jacob. And what about all those servants that we looked at before? Did they all come down to Egypt as well? And it's likely that the descendants of any that did come down would have likely been subsumed into the general Egyptian population at the time that the Israelites were later enslaved. Now, perhaps some of their descendants formed part of the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt at the time of the Exodus. And now comes the big reunion between Jacob and Joseph. And verses 29 and 30 of Genesis 46 we read, "So Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, 'Now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive.'" Now, this would have been an incredible reunion between Jacob and Joseph after Jacob thought for over 20 years that Joseph was dead. Now, what an amazing happy ending to the story of Jacob's life, to be reunited with Joseph for the last 17 years of his life that he will spend in Egypt. Now, the land of Goshen is a very fertile part of Egypt and the eastern part of the Nile Delta, which is where Jacob and his family and Joseph will also settle. Now, when I spoke on Abraham, we looked at the question of what the occupation of the patriarchs was. It is assumed usually that the patriarchs were just shepherds or herders of livestock. Now, if they were just shepherds, the following passage in Genesis 46 would seem out of place. It would seem that there were much more than just herders of livestock. Now Joseph tells them to focus on this one part of your overall business, being shepherds and herders of livestock, so the Pharaoh will give you the land of Goshen. Now in Exodus 1 verse 11 it says that the Israelites built Ramses, which is believed to be the city of High Ramses, built during the 19th dynasty in the reign of Ramses the Great. Now underneath the 19th dynasty city of High Ramses, Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak uncovered an older city. Now Bietak identified it as the ancient city of Avaris. Now today the site is called Tel El Daba. Now based on drill samples right across the area, they have determined the course of the branch of the Nile that went through this area during the Middle Kingdom. Now note at the top of the map the location of the 12th dynasty palace. Now on the right you can see beautiful bronze daggers that were found in the Semitic settlement whose style has been traced back to the land of Canaan. Now notice too on the map the location is what is believed to have been the palace of the Pharaoh's vizier. And there was also evidence of sheep and goats found in the Semitic settlement, indicating there were many shepherds there as well. Now one remarkable structure that was excavated at Avaris was a palace that was built over an original 4-roomed house. Now in one place in the palace it has 12 colonnades and there were found 12 tombs within its grounds. Now one of those tombs was particularly unusual. It was actually pyramid shaped. Now in this Semitic dignitary's tomb there was no trace of bones that were found of this particular individual. Now grave robbers don't usually steal bones, so it seems that the body was removed and not stolen. Now some scholars such as David Roll believe that this was the tomb of Joseph. Now in it was a large broken statue that, when it was still intact, would have stood at twice the height of a normal man. Now the statue was that of a Semitic man with red hair, and traces of paint show that he had a coat that was red, blue and gold. Now those three colours also dominated the interior of the vizier's palace. Now the face of the statue was defaced, but based on what was found in the middle picture shows what it may have originally looked like. Now this is a short video that was produced by the Austrian University team excavating at Avaris, which I'm just going to quickly play for you now. So we're coming into focus on the vizier's palace, and you can see the 12 tombs in the grounds. And you can see the 12 colonnades in the courtyard here. And going into the interior, you can see how those three colours dominate the red, blue and the gold. And as I mentioned previously, coincidentally, those are the same three colours of today's British royal family. Now, during the Middle Kingdom period when Israel was in Egypt, inscriptions with a script called the Proto-Sinaitic script have been found there, and also in the Sinai and in the land of Canaan. Now, examples of the script in these places include dates that note the years within the reign of Amenhotep III, one of the late 12th dynasty pharaohs, though the script could have been began earlier than his reign. Now it bears a certain similarity to both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hebrew, but there are far too few symbols to have been a picture language like hieroglyphics. Now Egyptian hieroglyphics and Mesopotamian cuneiform were made up of hundreds of different symbols like Japanese, making it a much more cumbersome language to learn and requiring far more space to convey the same amount of content compared to our alphabetic languages we have today. Now, like Hebrew and Phoenician, the Proto-Sinaitic script has only just over 20 symbols, making it the world's first true alphabet that we know of. Now, the documentary The Moses Controversy makes a strong case that this was an early version of Hebrew, and that it may have originated in the time of Joseph. Now Jacob is now very close to dying, but now he is about to pass on the birthright, the double portion of his inheritance that not only included his physical estate, but promises of great national wealth to their descendants. Now he is about to pass it on to Joseph's sons, but before he does something rather unusual. He formally adopts Joseph's sons as his own. Now, by adopting Joseph's boys as his own sons, they were actually to be considered full sons of Israel and full brothers of the others. Now, we see this take effect with the tribal allotments in the land of Israel. There is no allotment to the tribe of Joseph. What we see is allotments to the half-tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. And they effectively become the 12th and the 13th tribes of Israel. Now the number 13 is very much connected with the tribe of Manasseh, who we in the Church of God believe to have become the great nation of the United States. Now Gordon Tucker, in a Bible Review article from June 1994, entitled Jacob's Terrible Burden, offers one intriguing possibility for why Jacob adopted Joseph's sons. Now if you recall, when Jacob was fleeing from Laban, that his wife Rachel stole Laban's household gods, and Joseph didn't realise that Rachel had stolen them. Now in Genesis 31:32, Jacob makes a rash vow, and he says to Laban, "With whom you find your gods, do not let him live." Now this rash vow would have haunted him later when Rachel surrendered the idols to him at Shechem. Now soon after that, we find that Rachel dies in childbirth. Now with that vow in mind, Jacob may have been haunted by guilt, thinking that his vow cost Rachel his life. Now the guilt might explain his neurotic favouritism and protection of Joseph and Benjamin. Now Tucker comments that the adoption of Ephraim and Manasseh, even if it did not literally give Rachel more children, at least gave Jacob 2 more children from her, posthumously giving Rachel the additional children she never had. End of quote. Now Albert Barnes in his commentary states, the right of primogeniture has been forfeited by Reuben. The double portion of the inheritance is now transferred to Joseph. He is the firstborn of her, who is intended by Jacob to be his first and only wife. He has also been the means of saving all his father's house. End of quote. Now the specific birthright promise that God gave to Jacob in Genesis 35:11 of his descendants becoming a nation and a company of nation, he now passes directly on to Joseph's 2 sons. Now his eyesight is very dim. Now Joseph directs his oldest son Manasseh next to Jacob's right hand to be given the greater blessing, but Jacob, under God's inspiration, crosses his arms to give the younger son Ephraim the greater blessing. Now Jacob, in blessing the sons of Joseph in Genesis 48:19, says that one son, Manasseh, would become a great nation, and his other son, Ephraim, would become a multitude, or we could say a commonwealth of nations. Now before the Assyrian captivity, the tribe of Joseph's son Ephraim was never a multitude of nations. It was originally a tribe within the United Nation of Israel, and then the northern kingdom of Israel after Solomon So this can only be a prophecy for after the northern kingdom went into captivity at the hands of the Assyrians. Now, as I discussed in the last part of Lessons from Jacob, the descendants of the northern kingdom in the centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Assyrian Empire, eventually migrated into northwestern Europe. And there are no other brother nations today that come close to fulfilling this ancient prophecy, as well as the English-speaking nations of Britain, who become this multitude of Commonwealth of Nations, and America, who later become that single great nation. Now, the patriarch Jacob, before he died, gave a series of prophecies in Genesis 49 about the descendants of each of his 12 sons, and what shall befall them in the last days, which most likely refers to the time leading up to the second coming of Christ. Now, on the handout on the tribes of Israel that I gave to you previously when we went through Lessons from Jacob, I've given notes on the identity of each of the tribes in our modern day based on those clues and the indirect historical evidence that we have. Now, while Joseph inherited the birthright, Judah received the blessing of the patriarchal rule, or the scepter promise, as noted in verse 10. Now, Joseph had his own patriarchal household, and Judah would have been the next patriarch that ruled over the other brothers after Jacob died. Now, from his tribe would come the kings that ruled over Israel. Now, it says that he shall have a scepter up until Shiloh comes. Now, Shiloh means tranquility, but in reference to a person, it is interpreted as a peaceful one, or a peacemaker. Now, most people recognise this as a prophecy of Messiah, though Shiloh is also a variation of the name Solomon, which means peace. Now, Jacob eventually dies about 17 years after moving his family to Egypt, when Joseph is about 56 years old at the time that his father dies. Now, Joseph and his brothers took him up to Hebron to be buried in the cave that Abraham bought as a burial place. Now, during the 12th dynasty in the Middle Kingdom, a long 200-mile canal was built parallel with the Nile River that greatly increased the amount of land able to be cultivated, as well as siphoning off excess floodwaters. Now, while not called this in ancient times, Arabs today refer to it as the Bar Yusuf, which in English means the Canal of Joseph. Now, the story of its creation is told in the Jewish Week and the American Examiner of July 22, 1983, where it reads, "When Joseph was more than 100, he still held a high position in the Egyptian court. The other viziers and court officials, envying Joseph, persuaded the Pharaoh that to remain venerated, Joseph should not rest on his laurels. He must prove again his abilities. When the Pharaoh agreed, the viziers suggested an impossible project to convert the desert into a fertile area. Inspired by God, Joseph confounded his detractors by succeeding. He dug feeder canals and created the vast artificial lake in 1,000 days." End quote. Now, Joseph would live on for another 54 years after his father died. Now, before he died, he told his family to take his bones up to the promised land when God would lead them out of Egypt. Now, he died at the ripe old age of 110 years old and was embalmed and laid to rest in the tomb at his palace. Now, later, after the Exodus, his bones were exhumed and they were taken up to the promised land. Now, unlike Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, he wasn't buried in the family cave tomb at Hebron, but was buried in the plot of land that Joseph's family inherited from Jacob up at Shechem, and which you can see a picture of here. So, that concludes the remarkable life of the last of the 4 great patriarchs of Israel. Now, here are the 7 great lessons that we can learn from the life of Joseph. 1. Be aware of when others have an issue with you and do your part to reconcile with them. 2. Have a strong and positive work ethic, even in the worst of working situations, like Joseph. 3. Flee sexual immorality like Joseph did when he was tempted by Potiphar's wife. 4. Give the credit to God for the opportunities, knowledge and help that he gives you to succeed in life like Joseph did. 5. Have a contingency plan to help you deal with future problems and emergencies. 6. Maintain your trust in God through the dark times, and he will be faithful and exalt you in the long run. And 7. Have a forgiving attitude like Joseph had with his brothers who sold him into slavery. Let's put all those lessons into practice and be faithful servants of God, just like Joseph.